Imagine a city. It is powerful. It has thousands of people. It has markets, temples, and soldiers. The harvests are good. The rivers are full. Life is hard, but it is working. Then the rain stops. Not for 1 year, not for 2 years. For 20 years, the rain almost disappears. The crops die. The animals die. The people become hungry, then angry, then desperate. They fight each other. They leave their homes. They walk for hundreds of miles looking for water, looking for food, looking for survival. And then the city is gone, empty, silent, forgotten. This is not a story from a movie. This happened again and again. In Egypt, in China, in Rome, in the Americas, all across human history, the weather changed, and civilizations rose or fell because of it. Today, we are going to follow that story, the story of how climate, the long-term patterns of weather on Earth, shaped everything: our wars, our migrations, our cultures, our collapse. This is the history of climate and civilization. Hi, and welcome to Daily English Origins. Are you learning English? Great! Let's learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Let's get started. Most people think of history as the story of kings and queens, of battles and empires. But there is another story underneath all of that, a deeper story. It is the story of the earth itself, the earth's climate, meaning the typical weather patterns over long periods of time, has never been completely still. It moves, it shifts, it warms and cools in cycles, sometimes slowly, sometimes very fast. These changes affected everything. When it was warm and wet, crops grew easily. Food was plentiful. Plentiful means there was a lot of it. People had energy to build, to trade, to grow their populations. But when the climate turned cold, or dry, or unpredictable, the opposite happened. Harvest failed. A harvest is the time when farmers collect their crops, their wheat, their rice, their corn. When harvest failed, people went hungry. Hunger creates pressure. Pressure creates conflict. Conflict creates migration. Migration means people moving from one place to another to survive. This cycle repeated itself hundreds of times across thousands of years. And when we understand it, we begin to understand human history in a completely new way. To understand how climate shapes civilization, we must go back to the very beginning. About 12,000 years ago, something remarkable happened on Earth. Before this time, humans were hunter-gatherers. This means they did not stay in one place. They moved constantly, following animals and wild plants. They had no farms, no cities, no governments. Then the climate changed, in a good way. A long, cold period called the Ice Age began to end. The earth gradually became warmer and more stable. Stable means consistent, not changing wildly. Rainfall became more regular. Temperatures became more predictable. This was the moment humanity had been waiting for, even if they did not know it. In a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, an area of land in what is today Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, people discovered they could plant seeds intentionally. They could grow wheat and barley in the same place year after year because the rain came reliably. This was the agricultural revolution. Agriculture means farming. It was one of the most important moments in all of human history. Because of stable climate, humans stopped wandering. They built permanent villages. They stored food. They developed tools. They created language, art, and laws. Civilization, organized human society with shared systems, was born from the gift of good weather. No story of climate and civilization is more famous than the story of ancient Egypt. Egypt is surrounded by desert. It is dry, hot, and harsh. Under normal conditions, it would be almost impossible to feed millions of people there. But Egypt had one extraordinary advantage: the Nile River. Every year, the Nile flooded its banks. When it flooded, it left behind a layer of rich, dark soil called silt. Silt is a very fine, fertile material. Fertile means it is excellent for growing crops. Egyptian farmers planted wheat and other crops in this silt every year. The floods were their calendar, their religion, their life. The Egyptians called this flooding the gift of the Nile, and it truly was a gift. It allowed Egypt to become one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world, one that lasted for over 3,000 years. But here is the important lesson. The gift could become a curse. When the Nile flooded too little, the soil did not receive enough silt. Crops failed. When it flooded too much, entire villages were destroyed. The balance was everything. Egyptian records show that during periods of very low Nile floods, often connected to broader climate changes, there were famines, political instability, and even social collapse. Collapse means a sudden and dramatic breakdown of society. One of the most studied periods is called the First Intermediate Period, around 2200 BCE. BCE means before the Common Era, a way of counting years before the year zero. During this time, a long drought weakened the central government of Egypt. Local rulers fought each other. People rioted for food. A society that had lasted for centuries nearly broke apart, all because the river brought less water. While Egypt built its civilization around the Nile, another great civilization was growing between two other rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in a land called Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that means the land between the rivers. Today, this area is mostly the country of Iraq. The people of Mesopotamia built the world's first cities. Uruk, Ur, and Babylon were enormous urban centers. Cities with large populations. They had writing systems, mathematics, legal codes, and trade networks. Like Egypt, their success depended heavily on water management. They built complex irrigation systems. Irrigation means moving water from rivers to farm fields through canals and channels. Without irrigation, the dry climate of the region would have made farming impossible. But the climate of Mesopotamia was less stable than Egypt's. It was more vulnerable to drought. Vulnerable means easily hurt or damaged. Around 4,200 years ago, a dramatic climate event struck the entire Middle East. Scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event. This means it happened approximately 4,200 years ago. Temperatures changed, and rainfall decreased sharply across a huge area. The result was catastrophic. Catastrophic means extremely destructive and terrible. The Akkadian Empire, one of history's first true empires, which had conquered and unified Mesopotamia, simply collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Populations moved south, closer to what little water remained. Archaeological evidence, physical remains found by scientists, shows layers of dust and drought in the soil from exactly this period. One ancient inscription, a piece of writing carved into stone, reads, "For the first time since cities were built and founded, the great agricultural tracts produced no grain. The inundated tracts produced no fish." That is the voice of a civilization in crisis, written over 4,000 years ago. And the cause was climate change. On the other side of the world, in East Asia, another great civilization was developing along two great rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. China's early civilizations, like those in Mesopotamia and Egypt, depended entirely on the behavior of these rivers. And the Yellow River, known in Chinese as Huanghe, was one of the most powerful and dangerous rivers in the world. It flooded regularly and violently. It was sometimes called China's sorrow because of the terrible floods that killed thousands of people and destroyed farmland. But these same floods also deposited rich soil that made farming possible for hundreds of millions of people over centuries. Chinese culture developed a very interesting political idea connected to climate: the mandate of heaven. This was the belief that the emperor, the ruler of China, had the blessing of heaven to rule the country. But this blessing was conditional. Conditional means it depended on certain things being true. If the emperor ruled wisely and justly, heaven would reward China with good weather, good harvests, and peace. But if the emperor was corrupt or weak, heaven would express its anger through natural disasters, floods, droughts, famines, and earthquakes. These disasters were seen as signs that the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven and should be replaced. This idea was extraordinarily powerful. It directly connected climate events to political legitimacy. Legitimacy means the right to hold power. Historians have found strong correlations, matching patterns between periods of climate stress in China and periods of political revolution and dynastic change. A dynasty is a series of rulers from the same family. When harvests failed repeatedly due to drought or flooding, peasant rebellions, uprisings by poor farmers, often followed. New dynasties rose from the chaos. Climate did not just affect food supply in China, it literally shaped how people thought about power and government. Around 1200 BCE, something extraordinary and terrifying happened. It was not just one civilization that fell. Across the entire eastern Mediterranean, an area including modern Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and the Middle East, almost every major civilization collapsed within a span of 50 years. This event is called the Bronze Age collapse. The Bronze Age was a period in history when the most advanced tool and weapon technology used bronze, a metal. The collapse refers to the sudden end of this entire era of civilization. The great Mycenaean civilization of Greece disappeared. The powerful Hittite Empire in Turkey crumbled. Important cities along the coast of modern Lebanon and Syria burned and were abandoned. Even Egypt, mighty ancient Egypt, survived but was severely weakened and never fully recovered its former greatness. For a long time, historians debated why this happened. Was it invasions, civil war, disease? The answer, modern research suggests, is all of these things. But behind all of them was climate. A severe drought lasting decades struck the eastern Mediterranean around this exact time. Scientists have studied ancient pollen and tree rings, circular patterns inside a tree trunk that record annual growth, to confirm this. When years are dry, the rings are thin. When years are wet, the rings are wide. The evidence is clear. A megadrought hit the region. When food became scarce, the complex trade networks that connected these civilizations began to break down. Scarcity means there is not enough of something. Trading ships stopped sailing because there was nothing to trade. Palace economies. Economic systems controlled by royal palaces could no longer pay soldiers or feed populations. Groups of desperate, displaced people, sometimes called the Sea Peoples in Egyptian records, began migrating and raiding. Raiding means attacking settlements to take food and resources. One civilization's collapse weakened its neighbors, who then collapsed, weakening their neighbors in turn. It was like a chain of falling dominoes. The Bronze Age collapse is one of history's most powerful examples of how climate stress can unravel, break apart, even the most sophisticated human societies when they are deeply interconnected. Not all climate change is destructive. Sometimes a favorable climate helps a civilization rise to extraordinary heights. This is exactly what happened with Rome. From approximately 250 BCE to 400 CE, CE means Common Era, a way of counting years after the year zero, the Mediterranean experienced what scientists now call the Roman Warm Period. This was a time of unusually warm temperatures and reliable rainfall across Europe and the Mediterranean basin. The timing could not have been better for the Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire. Warm temperatures meant longer growing seasons. A growing season is the period of the year when conditions are right for crops to grow. Longer growing seasons meant more food. More food meant a larger, healthier, better-fed population. A well-fed population could supply soldiers, workers, and tax revenue, money collected by the government. Rome expanded aggressively during this period, conquering Spain, North Africa, Gaul, modern France, Greece, Egypt, and much of the Middle East. Its population grew to perhaps 70 million people. Its engineering projects, roads, aqueducts, amphitheaters were staggeringly complex. An aqueduct is a structure that carries water from one place to another, often across great distances. Historian Kyle Harper, who has written extensively on this topic, argues that Rome's remarkable success was not only due to Roman genius and military power, it was also significantly due to good weather. The Roman climate optimum, the best climate period, supported agriculture on a massive scale across the entire empire. From Britain to Egypt, farmers could produce reliable surpluses. A surplus is more than what is needed. These surpluses fed cities, armies, and trade networks. Rome did not just benefit from good weather. The Romans understood their dependence on it. Their religious calendar was filled with festivals and prayers dedicated to agricultural gods, Ceres, the goddess of grain, and Neptune, associated with water. But as we will see in the next part of our story, the warm period would not last forever. And when the climate turned, Rome would face challenges that no army could defeat. Rome was the greatest empire the Western world had ever seen. At its peak, it controlled land from Scotland in the north to Egypt in the south, from Portugal in the west to modern Iraq in the east. But by the 400s CE, something was going very wrong. Historians have debated the fall of Rome for centuries. Some blame corrupt politicians. Some blame military weakness. Some blame the rise of Christianity. Some blame invasions by Germanic tribes. All of these factors were real. But modern climate science has added a powerful new piece to this puzzle. Around 250 CE, the Roman warm period began to end. Temperatures dropped slightly, but significantly. Rainfall patterns shifted. In some regions, droughts returned. In others, cooler temperatures shortened growing seasons. Then, around 536 CE, slightly after Rome's western half had already collapsed, something catastrophic happened. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly in Iceland, sent enormous clouds of ash and dust into the atmosphere. The atmosphere is the layer of gases surrounding the Earth. This ash blocked sunlight across the entire northern hemisphere for 18 months. Temperatures dropped dramatically. Crops failed across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year." This period is now called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. It lasted roughly from 536 to 660 CE. It happened at the same time with plague, famine, mass migration, and the final disappearance of classical civilization in much of Europe. Rome did not fall only because of bad generals or weak emperors. It fell in part because the climate that had supported its greatness for centuries turned against it. Climate does not only cause drought and famine, it also shapes the conditions for disease. In 541 CE, a devastating plague swept through the Byzantine Empire. The eastern continuation of the Roman Empire centered in Constantinople, the city we now call Istanbul in modern Turkey. This plague, called the Plague of Justinian, after the emperor who ruled at the time, was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later cause the Black Death. A bacterium is a microscopic, single-celled organism that can cause disease. The climate connection is significant. Research suggests that the climate disruptions of the 530s and 540s, the volcanic cooling, the crop failures, the food shortages, weakened human immune systems and created ideal conditions for disease to spread rapidly. When people are malnourished, when they don't have enough nutrition, their bodies cannot fight infection as effectively. Malnourished populations become vulnerable populations, and vulnerable populations become devastated populations when a new disease arrives. The plague of Justinian killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, perhaps half the population of the Byzantine Empire. It fundamentally weakened an empire that had been trying to reunify the Roman world. Climate stress, famine, and disease worked together like a terrible team, dismantling civilizations that had stood for generations. After centuries of cold and crisis, the climate warmed again. From approximately 900 CE to 1300 CE, Europe and parts of the North Atlantic experienced a period of relative warmth known as the medieval warm period. This was not as warm as today, but it was significantly warmer than the cold centuries that came before. The results were dramatic and positive at first. In Europe, warmer temperatures allowed farming to spread northward into regions that had previously been too cold to cultivate. Cultivate means to prepare and use land for growing crops. New villages appeared in highlands and forests that had never been farmed before. Food production increased. Populations grew rapidly. In England, vineyards, farms where grapes are grown to make wine, flourished as far north as Yorkshire. Grapes need warm summers. Their presence in northern England tells us exactly how warm the climate had become. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the region that includes modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the warming climate opened up sea routes that had previously been blocked by ice. The Vikings took full advantage. Norse sailors explored and colonized Iceland around 870 CE. By around 985 CE, a Norwegian explorer named Eric the Red sailed even further west and found a large, cold island. He called it Greenland, a deliberate marketing strategy designed to make it sound attractive to settlers. And around 1000 CE, Eric's son, Leif Erikson, sailed all the way to the coast of North America, nearly 500 years before Christopher Columbus. He called this land Vinland, meaning wine land, because grapes grew there. The medieval warm period had literally pushed human exploration to the edge of the known world. The story of the Mongols is one of the most dramatic in all of world history. In just a few decades, Genghis Khan and his successors built the largest contiguous land empire ever. An empire where all the land is connected without interruption. At its peak, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. How did a relatively small group of nomadic horsemen accomplish this? Nomadic means they moved from place to place without permanent settlements. The answer, surprisingly, has a significant climate component. The Mongols lived on the vast grasslands of Central Asia, called the steppes. Their entire way of life depended on grass. Their horses needed grass. Their cattle and sheep needed grass. Without grass, the Mongol war machine, built on fast, well-fed cavalry, could not function. Cavalry means soldiers who fight on horseback. In the years just before Genghis Khan's major conquests, beginning around the early 1200s, climate records show that Mongolia experienced an unusual period of increased rainfall and mild temperatures. This caused the grasslands to expand and become lush. Lush means thick, green, and healthy. More grass meant more horses. More horses meant larger, better-fed armies. Better armies meant faster and more powerful conquest. Scientists have studied ancient tree rings from the Mongolian region and found clear evidence of this wet period exactly coinciding with the rise of Mongol power. But here is the twist. As the Mongols conquered more territory, they moved into regions with very different climates. In Persia, China, and Eastern Europe, their horses needed to find food in environments they were not adapted to. This created logistical challenges. Logistical means related to the practical organization of complex operations. Some historians argue that climate limits, like the edge of the European grasslands in modern Hungary, actually set the boundaries of Mongol conquest in the West. The Mongols stopped in Hungary not just because of military resistance, but because the European forests and farmland beyond could not easily support their massive horse armies. Even the world's greatest conquerors could not completely escape the rules of climate. Before we continue, if you're finding this story fascinating and you're improving your English at the same time, please take 1 second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps us create more stories like this one for you. Thank you so much. Now, let's keep going. The 14th century, the 1300s, was one of the worst periods in human history, and it began with the weather. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced a catastrophe known as the Great Famine. A famine is a severe and widespread shortage of food that causes mass starvation. The cause was climate. After the centuries of warmth during the medieval warm period, temperatures in Europe began to drop. Cold, wet summers rotted crops in the fields before they could be harvested. Rain fell at the wrong times. Grain stores, the food saved from previous years, ran out. An estimated 10 to 25% of Northern Europe's population died from hunger and related diseases during this famine. Millions of people, families torn apart, communities destroyed. Populations that survived were weakened and malnourished. Then, just as Europe was beginning to slowly recover, something far worse arrived. In 1347, ships arriving from the Black Sea region brought a terrible new disease to European ports. It spread with horrifying speed. Within just a few years, it had killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population. This was the Black Death, the bubonic plague. The plague was caused by that same bacterium we mentioned earlier, Yersinia pestis. It was carried by fleas that lived on rats. But the conditions that allowed it to spread so devastatingly were prepared in part by climate. The climate cooling that began in the 1300s is now recognized as the beginning of a longer period historians call the Little Ice Age. Cooler temperatures affected the behavior of rodent populations, mice, rats, and other small animals that carry disease. Climate shifts disrupted ecosystems, pushing rodents closer to human settlements in search of warmth and food. A weakened, hungry human population had almost no resistance. The Black Death reshaped European civilization profoundly. Profoundly means deeply and in a fundamental way. Labor became scarce because so many workers had died. This actually gave surviving peasants, poor farmers and workers, more economic power than they had ever had before. They could demand higher wages. They could leave bad landlords and find better ones. Some historians argue that the Black Death, by killing so many and reshaping the economy, actually contributed to the conditions that eventually led to the Renaissance, the great rebirth of art, science, and culture in Europe, beginning in the 1400s. Destruction created the conditions for renewal. That is one of history's most difficult but important lessons. The Little Ice Age was not a true ice age. It was not as severe as the great glacial periods of the distant past. But it was a prolonged period of significantly cooler temperatures that affected the entire planet, especially the northern hemisphere from roughly 1300 to 1850 CE. And its effects were enormous. In Europe, alpine glaciers, large rivers of ice in the mountains, expanded, swallowing villages that had existed for generations. Farmers in Scandinavia, Scotland, and northern France found that crops that had grown reliably for centuries suddenly failed year after year. In China, the Ming Dynasty, a powerful Chinese imperial dynasty that ruled from 1368 to 1644, faced terrible droughts in its northern provinces during the coldest decades of the Little Ice Age. Droughts led to failed harvests. Failed harvests led to famine. Famine led to peasant rebellions. And peasant rebellions, combined with attacks from the Manchu people from the north, brought down the entire dynasty in 1644. In the Ottoman Empire, the vast Turkish empire that controlled much of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe, the 17th century brought waves of cold, drought, famine, and political instability that historians call the general crisis of the 17th century. But perhaps the most famous climate-related political event of the Little Ice Age was the French Revolution. In the late 1780s, France experienced a series of extremely cold winters and bad harvests. The price of bread, the basic food of ordinary French people, rose so high that poor families spent almost all of their income just on bread, leaving nothing for anything else. By 1789, hungry, desperate, and furious French citizens rose up against King Louis XVI and the aristocracy, the wealthy, noble class that controlled most of France's land and wealth. The French Revolution began on July 14, 1789, when a crowd stormed the Bastille prison in Paris. Within a few years, the king was executed, the aristocracy was dismantled, and one of the most radical political transformations in modern history was underway. Historians have debated the causes of the French Revolution endlessly. Political philosophy, Enlightenment ideas, economic inequality, and weak governance all played roles. But climate historian Jeffrey Parker and others have argued convincingly that bad weather and bread prices were the trigger, the immediate cause that finally pushed a suffering population to revolution. When people are hungry enough, they stop being afraid. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, beginning in 1492, they did not find empty land. They found civilizations, some of them among the most sophisticated on earth. The Aztec Empire in central Mexico had a capital city, Tenochtitlan, that was larger than any city in Europe at the time. Its population may have reached 200,000 to 300,000 people. The Inca Empire in South America controlled a territory larger than the Roman Empire at its height, connected by thousands of kilometers of roads. Both of these empires were eventually destroyed by European conquest. The Spanish conquistadors, Spanish soldiers and explorers, used military force, political manipulation, and alliances with rival native groups to overthrow them. But there was another weapon, one the Europeans did not even know they carried: disease. European explorers and soldiers brought with them diseases that the native peoples of the Americas had never encountered. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. These illnesses swept through indigenous populations with catastrophic speed. Estimates suggest that within 100 years of first contact, between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas had died. This was perhaps the largest demographic catastrophe in human history. Demographic means related to human population. Now, where does climate enter this story? In two important ways. First, research has shown that the Americas in the decades before European contact had already been experiencing climate stress. Droughts, floods, and irregular harvest had weakened several major civilizations. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest had already largely abandoned their great cliff cities, partly due to a severe drought in the late 1200s. The Maya civilization in Central America, once magnificent, had already collapsed centuries earlier, partly due to prolonged drought. Some historians argue that climate stress had already weakened the social fabric, the connected systems of government, economy, and community of many American civilizations before Europeans arrived. This made conquest easier. Second, after the massive population die-off from European diseases, something strange happened to the climate of the Americas. Tens of millions of people had been farming the land, cutting forests, and burning vegetation for thousands of years. When those people died, their farmland was abandoned. Forests regrew across enormous areas. Trees absorbed carbon dioxide, a gas in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, or CO2, is a greenhouse gas, meaning it traps heat in the atmosphere. When massive new forests grew across the Americas, they absorbed enormous amounts of CO2 from the atmosphere. Some climate scientists believe this may have contributed to a measurable cooling of global temperatures in the early 1600s. A cooling that made the Little Ice Age slightly worse in Europe. The deaths of millions of indigenous Americans may have literally changed the global climate. This is one of the most sobering and complex connections between human history and climate science that researchers have discovered. For all of human history up to this point, climate changed humanity. Droughts ended empires. Cold periods triggered revolutions. Floods shaped religions and governments. But in the 1800s, for the first time, humanity began to change the climate. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the late 1700s and spread rapidly across Europe and North America throughout the 1800s. It was a period of extraordinary transformation. Factories replaced workshops. Steam engines replaced horses. Coal, a black rock that burns intensely, replaced wood and wind as the primary source of energy. Coal is a fossil fuel. A fossil fuel is a fuel formed from the ancient remains of plants and animals buried underground for millions of years. When burned, fossil fuels release enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, CO2, into the atmosphere. For most of the 1800s, nobody worried about this. The Industrial Revolution created wealth, cities, railways, and modern medicine. Life expectancy, the average age a person could expect to live to, began rising for the first time in centuries. But scientists were watching. As early as 1856, an American scientist named Eunice Newton Foote conducted experiments showing that CO2 trapped heat from sunlight. In 1896, Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius calculated that doubling the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere could raise global temperatures by several degrees. These warnings were largely ignored. The world kept burning coal, then oil, then natural gas, and with every decade the concentration, the amount per unit of CO2 in the atmosphere grew higher. Humanity had become a geological force. Geological means relating to the physical structure and processes of the earth. For the first time in 4.5 billion years of Earth's history, one species was deliberately and then accidentally altering the planet's climate system. The connection between human behavior, climate, and civilization collapse is not only a story from the ancient past, it happened in modern America. In the 1930s, the Great Plains of the United States, a vast, flat region covering states like Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and Colorado, experienced an environmental catastrophe unlike anything Americans had ever seen. It was called the Dust Bowl. The story began decades earlier. After the American Civil War ended in 1865, millions of settlers moved west and began farming the Great Plains. They plowed, turned over the native grasses that had covered the land for thousands of years. These deep-rooted grasses had held the soil in place through centuries of wind and drought. When the grasses were destroyed and replaced with wheat fields, the soil became vulnerable. Vulnerable means easily damaged. Then, in the early 1930s, a severe drought struck the region. Without the native grasses to hold the soil, and without rain to keep it moist, the dry topsoil, the upper layer of earth where crops grow, simply blew away. Dust storms of unimaginable size swept across the plains. Some clouds of dust were so enormous they reached the east coast of the United States, darkening the skies over New York City and Washington, D.C. On what became known as Black Sunday, April 14, 1935, a single dust storm moved 300,000 tons of topsoil in one afternoon. Farms were buried, animals died. Families who had invested everything in their land lost it completely. Hundreds of thousands of people, known as Okies because many came from Oklahoma, packed everything they owned and drove west to California, desperately seeking work and survival. Author John Steinbeck immortalized their journey in his famous novel, The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939. The Dust Bowl was not a purely natural disaster. It was the result of human agricultural decisions interacting with a natural drought cycle. When people ignored the ecology, the natural relationships between living things and their environment, of the land they were farming, the land fought back. It was a modern echo of every ancient civilization that had collapsed by mismanaging its relationship with the natural world. The 20th century was the most violent in human history. 2 world wars, dozens of smaller conflicts, hundreds of millions of deaths. Climate was not the primary cause of these conflicts. Political ideology, nationalism, and economic competition played far larger roles. But climate continued to operate quietly in the background, shaping the conditions that made conflicts more likely. One powerful example is the Syrian Civil War, which began in 2011. Between 2006 and 2010, Syria experienced the worst drought in its recorded history. This was not a natural variation in weather. Climate scientists have found strong evidence that human-caused climate change made this drought more severe and more likely. The drought devastated Syrian agriculture. Over 1 million farmers and their families were forced to move from rural areas to already overcrowded cities. This mass internal migration created enormous social pressure. Unemployment rose. Resources were stretched. Frustration grew. When political protests began in 2011 as part of the broader Arab Spring movement, a wave of democratic uprisings across the Middle East, the Syrian government responded with violent repression. The country descended into civil war. The Syrian civil war has since created one of the largest refugee crises, situations where large numbers of people are forced to flee their homes, since World War II. Over 13 million Syrians have been displaced. Displaced means forced to leave their homes. Climate scientists and security experts now regularly study the connections between climate stress, migration, resource competition, and conflict. The pattern that destroyed Bronze Age civilizations and brought down the Roman Empire is still operating today, just in a more complex modern context. We have traveled an enormous distance in this story. From the first farmers of Mesopotamia 12,000 years ago to the Syrian drought of the 21st century. And through all of this history, certain patterns emerge. Patterns are repeated designs or sequences that we can recognize. The first pattern is this: civilizations that depend on a single resource or a single system are extremely vulnerable to climate disruption. Ancient Egypt depended entirely on the Nile. When the Nile failed, Egypt suffered. The Great Plains farmers depended on removing native grasses. When drought came, the land failed them. Diversity, having multiple sources of food, water, and energy, creates resilience. Resilience means the ability to recover from difficulties. The second pattern is adaptation. Again and again through history, the civilizations that survived climate stress were not always the strongest or the richest. They were the most adaptable. Adaptable means able to change and adjust to new conditions. The Maya developed sophisticated water storage systems during dry periods. The Romans built aqueducts that moved water hundreds of kilometers. The nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppes developed portable, flexible ways of living that allowed them to follow grass and water wherever it moved. Flexibility and innovation, the ability to create new solutions, were often more important than raw power. The third pattern is warning and ignorance. In almost every case of climate-related collapse we have studied, there were signs. There were droughts, failed harvests, and small crises before the final catastrophic breakdown. Civilizations that listened to those early warnings and adapted survived longer. Those that ignored them, that assumed the good times would continue forever, were the ones that collapsed. This third pattern is perhaps the most urgent lesson for our own time. We are now living in a moment unlike any other in the 12,000 years of human civilization. The global average temperature is rising faster than at almost any point in Earth's recorded history. The primary cause is the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, which releases CO2 and other greenhouse gases that trap heat in the atmosphere. The effects are already being felt around the world. Glaciers, those ancient rivers of ice in mountains, are melting on every continent. Sea levels are rising, threatening coastal cities from Miami to Mumbai, from Shanghai to Amsterdam. Extreme weather events, more powerful hurricanes, longer droughts, more intense floods are becoming more frequent. In sub-Saharan Africa, prolonged droughts are pushing millions of farmers off their land. In Bangladesh, one of the most densely populated countries on earth, rising seas regularly flood farmland with salt water, making it impossible to grow crops. In the American West, devastating wildfires burn millions of acres each year during increasingly dry summers. And the migration has already begun. The United Nations estimates that by 2050, between 200 million and 1 billion people could be displaced by climate-related changes, rising seas, desertification, and water scarcity. Desertification means the process by which fertile land becomes desert. Water scarcity means not having enough clean water. This will be the largest human migration in history, larger than the movements that followed the Bronze Age collapse, larger than the migrations of the Little Ice Age, larger than the Dust Bowl. The question is not whether climate will challenge civilization in the 21st century. History makes the answer to that question perfectly clear. It already is, and it will continue to do so. The question is how we will respond. We began this story with a simple image, a powerful city, full of life, and then silence. Empty streets, abandoned temples, a civilization that climate helped build and climate helped destroy. That story has repeated itself countless times across 12,000 years. The Akkadian Empire, ancient Egypt, the Bronze Age civilizations, Rome, the Maya, the Ming Dynasty, all of them experienced the power of climate to reshape human life. But here's what is equally true and equally important. Humanity is still here. Every time a civilization collapsed, people survived. They adapted, they moved, they built again. Sometimes they built something better. The Black Death, as devastating as it was, contributed to conditions that led to the Renaissance, an explosion of art, science, and human creativity. The famines and cold of the Little Ice Age drove innovations in agriculture, heating, and food storage that changed Europe forever. Human beings are remarkably, stubbornly, beautifully resilient. But resilience is not passive. It is not simply waiting for disaster and hoping to survive. True resilience, the kind that history rewards, is active. It is learning from the past. It is listening to early warnings. It is choosing adaptation over denial and cooperation over conflict. The ancient farmers of the Fertile Crescent did not know they were building the foundation of civilization. They were simply trying to survive another season. But their small choices, to plant rather than wander, to store rather than consume everything immediately, to work together rather than alone, created everything that came after. We face our own season now. The climate is changing, faster than at almost any time in human memory. The warnings have been written, not in ancient stone tablets this time, but in rising temperatures, melting ice, and flooding coastlines. History does not tell us that collapse is inevitable. It tells us that collapse is a choice. A slow choice made across many years of ignored warnings and missed opportunities. And it tells us that renewal is also a choice, made by people who decide that the story is not over, that adaptation is possible, and that the future is worth building. The oldest story in human civilization is still being written, and we are the ones holding the pen. Hi, and welcome to Daily English Origins. Are you learning English? Great! Let's learn English with a very interesting story. Hey there, just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.